Hello and welcome everyone for this lecture on Aurobindo Ghosh, and through Aurobindo we will try to understand his ideas on self and also his views on community and religion. In this lecture we are going to discuss Aurobindo's thought and situating him in his larger historical political context, and also the transformation or evolution in his life as well as in his thinking. So, we will discuss that, and finally we will engage seriously with one of the key themes in Aurobindo Ghosh and his political thought, that is idea of self. We are going to discuss, and I would also like to summarize whatever we have done so far in this course. So, Aurobindo Ghosh is the third thinker, and we have done Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Rabindranath Tagore. So, I will request you all to watch that video and send us your comments, suggestions, feedbacks and queries, and we will try to respond to those as soon as possible, or most certainly within 24 hours. So, I invite you all to send your comments, feedbacks and suggestions on the lectures we have done so far. So, today we are going to discuss Aurobindo Ghosh, and Aurobindo Ghosh in a way shares some of the thought or idioms or vocabulary with the thinkers we have done, and they also share some of the ideas about how to transform society, how to imagine or envision a new individual, a new self, and what is the role of that self in his or her community and also in the larger community of the humanity as such. So, all these thinkers do share such ideals, but Aurobindo Ghosh is uniquely positioned in these among these thinkers. He was someone who was in initial years completely cut off from his land, that is his native Bengal, the language Bengali, and he remained aloof or kept aloof from whatever political or social happenings was happening in his native land in Bengal and also in India. So, he was educated and remained cut off from the happenings that was going on or unfolding in India. So, intellectually or in initial years he remained somewhat aloof and cut off from the native land. When he came back, then he began to seriously engage with his native language Bengali. In fact, he started from the beginning, from the scratch, and dwelled deeper and deeper into Indian intellectual tradition, Vedas, Upanishad and many other texts, and he translated a lot of them. He engaged very actively in the radical politics of his time for a brief period, and then completely retired from the politics and get involved in more yogic discipline or intellectual engagement in terms of writing and all. So, Aurobindo Ghosh remains somewhat a mystic figure, and yet very significant in terms of his contribution in different areas, including active politics and also some of the contemplative philosophical exercise. So, we are going to discuss Aurobindo Ghosh in that sense, and there is some challenges while doing it, but also there are some significance of engaging with his thought and ideals. So, what we find is Aurobindo Ghosh, who is regarded as one of the prominent philosopher of 20th century India, he combined both political and spiritual dimensions of human life in his political thought. Now, this remains somewhat deeply intertwined in his thought and action, where he did not separate politics from spirituality and spirituality from politics. For him, this human life or human condition is in a process of evolution, and there this shift, or not really the shift, evolution from a political to the spiritual realization is something in a continuum, not a kind of break or kind of two separate dimension. So in his all political thought, the combination of political and spiritual dimension of human life is very central, and as we have just said, that he is regarded as the one of the prominent philosophers of 20th century India, and he is also known as a revolutionary, a spiritual leader, poet, philosopher, and socio-political thinker. So his interest is quite varied in terms of his engagement, his personal involvement with the social political upheaval of his time, his sensitivity towards the larger challenges before the humanity as a poet, as a philosopher, or place of India in the larger world, his motherhood or the nation, the way he defined. He was very radical in his approach to politics, and he was put in jail because of his involvement in the revolutionary activities in Bengal for a year, and then he transformed himself, and in his own words realized the spiritual need of realization of true self or true being, which he called Adesh. And after realizing that, he retired from the politics and became a spiritual leader. Aurobindo Ghosh combined all these different strands of activities and thought in his own life, in his own personality, and that makes him more complex, somewhat mysterious, and uniquely positioned among the modern Indian political thinkers. The challenge for then us to examine and understand Aurobindo Ghosh and his thought is, for a very long time his personality and contribution is not examined in its totality, which often led to reducing him merely as a religious figure or a mystic figure or a spiritual leader, not having practical, pragmatic application in resolving day-to-day political or other challenges. The tendency of secularists, so-called secularists, who wanted to separate their ideas, their thought from anything that is closer to religion or something which is embedded in religion. So the tendency of the secularists to distance themselves from him, as well as the selective appropriation of Aurobindo by the right wingers, so-called right wingers in India, are equally accountable for somewhat under exploration of Sri Aurobindo's thought and ideals in their totality. So this uniqueness in his life and in his thought and ideals, those who call themselves secularists tend to distance themselves from the so-called religious thought of Aurobindo, reducing him merely as a religious spiritual guru, and on the other hand you have many right wing trying to selectively appropriate Aurobindo, certainly his idea of nation as a mother, or his religious definition of nationalism. So one of the thinker like Karan Singh, he considered him as a prophet of Indian nationalism. So there is this kind of challenges on the part of both secularists or the right wingers in their engagement with the Aurobindo and his thought, and that is perhaps the reason why there is a kind of lacking in engaging with his thought and ideals in its totality, not selectively or not by reducing him to merely as a religious and a spiritual thinker. So therefore the need is to revisit Aurobindo and engage with his thought in all possible dimension, not merely through a spiritual or a religious lens, but in all possible dimensions, which we will discuss as we move on in this course. And now there is a new kind of reading or engagement with Aurobindo and his thought in contemporary times. Most recent is Peter His edited work on Aurobindo Ghosh. So now to understand the significance of Aurobindo, it is appropriate perhaps to quote Deshbandhu Chittaranjan Das when he was defending Aurobindo Ghosh in famous Alipur bomb conspiracy case, and because of that he was put in the Alipur jail. So he was being tried with many other revolutionaries, and Deshbandhu Chittaranjan Das was defending Aurobindo Ghosh, and he appealed to the magistrate using these words which clearly signifies the life and teachings of Sri Aurobindo. And he writes, I quote, "My appeal to you is this, that long after the controversy will be hustled in silence," this controversy surrounding Alipur bomb conspiracy, that long after the controversy will be hushed in silence, long after this turmoil and agitation will have ceased, the turmoil in the political arena or agitation that was happening, when long after such turmoil and agitation will have ceased, long after he is dead and gone, he will be looked upon as the poet of patriotism, as the prophet of nationalism, and the lover of humanity. So this is the unique combination of Aurobindo Ghosh in the words of Deshbandhu Chittaranjan Das, where he considered him not just as the poet of patriotism or the prophet of nationalism, but also as someone who was deeply in love with the humanity and focusing more towards the unity with others, and we will discuss when we will discuss his idea on self. So, and then he goes on that long after he is dead and gone, his words will be echoed and re-echoed, not only in India, but across distant seas and lands. Thereafter, I say that the man in his position is not only standing before the bar of this court, but before the bar of High Court of history. So that certainly signifies the life and ideals of Sri Aurobindo Ghosh and his intellectual transformation in terms of political happenings and positioning himself or his response to such happenings. Further on, his life and thought exemplify a living dialogue between what is called Eastern and what is Western philosophy. So one professor, Robert McDermott, states that the complementary of politics and spirituality typifies Sri Aurobindo's ability to draw diverse streams into a rich and dynamic synthesis. So he is also considered as a kind of syncretic thinker which accommodates, which unites, who synthesize different strands of thought within a culture or across the culture. As he combined politics and yoga on the one hand, he also combined Western and Indian values. So in his own life, these combination of politics with yoga or spirituality on the one hand, or values in different cultural or intellectual tradition on the other. So he was more a kind of synthesizing force in terms of articulating his ideas on many social political issues. And the ashram that Aurobindo established in the city of Auroville even today continue to practice most of these ideals through their day-to-day social and collective activity, which transcends the limitation of a national boundary or a nation state. So therefore, as we have seen, Aurobindo Ghosh remains somewhat a mystic figure because of his engagement, his evolution in his activity, personal life, and also in his philosophy, where he tries to combine both the politics and spirituality together. And this combination is not just limited to Aurobindo. As we have seen before, when Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Tagore, and when we will discuss Vivekananda or Mohandas Gandhi or even Iqbal, we'll see this occurrence of relationship between religion on the other hand, politics on the other. But the way Aurobindo theorized his ideals of nation, nationalism, India's role in the world is deeply connected with his understanding of this relationship between political and the spiritual. So now to briefly discuss his early life, his personal life. His father Krishnadhan Ghosh was a doctor, and he was deeply influenced by modern Western lifestyle or value system, and wanted his children to be reared in this same tradition. So he wanted their sons should have European upbringing. So along with his brothers, Aurobindo was sent to an Irish nun school in Darjeeling and later to England, with this clear instruction that Aurobindo should be totally kept in distance from any Indian influence. So for a very long period, as I was saying in the beginning, he was completely kept aloof from anything that is related to India or Indian matters. There in England, he graduated from King's College with academic excellence, and he also appeared in Indian Civil Service examination, which he could not qualify because he failed in the writing test. So after getting the education and having achieved success in his academic career, he came to India and worked in Baroda states for 14 years. And this is the period when he seriously engaged with his own native mother tongue, or many Indian texts or treatises or ancient Upanishad and other texts, and also engaged with the political activities in India. So this began with the publication of New Lamps for Old. So this intellectual response to the necessities or requirements of India when he returned and joined the Baroda state. He wrote that, theorist, trifler, though I may be called, I again assert as our first and holiest duty the cultivation and enlightenment of the proletariat. The proletariat is, as I have striven to show, the real key to the situation. Torpid he is and immobile, he is nothing of an actual force, but he is a very great force, and whoever succeeds in understanding become by the very fact master of the future. Now this is something he was writing before the Russian Revolution, before Gandhi emerged on the scene, before Indian struggle for freedom took the character of a mass movement. But he was the one who realized the force of the masses or the proletariat in social or political transformation, and he in fact somewhat foresee the emergence of a leader who can unite this force, mobilize this force, which is at present stage immobile or aloof or indifferent to the political situations and the political happenings, or in other words, historically speaking, the Indian National Congress, dominated by the moderates, believing in the constitutional method for social political reforms, could not really energize these proletariat, and which is the basis for true social political transformation. And then we move on to his active political life, which is for a very brief period from 1905 to 1910. He actively engaged in the politics and was connected or familiar with the revolutionaries' activities in Bengal. What you find is Aurobindo Ghosh is not just giving the intellectual response to the situations and unfolding of events in the political life of India, but also himself was involved in many activities. And in this very brief period, he emerged as a prominent leader of Indian national movement, and he was invited not just by many natives in his native province of Bengal, but also in Maharashtra or in Punjab or in other parts. So he became a force to reckon with. Even the Britishers feared his active involvement in the political activities. So within Indian National Congress, he was the very influential members of the extremist section. So as you are saying that during the time he was engaging with the politics, Congress was by and large divided into two groups, extremist and the moderate. In the extremist, you have Bal Gangadhar Tilak, C.R. Das, along with Aurobindo Ghosh, and the moderate faction of Congress was represented by Firoz Shah Mehta, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, among many others. So, Aurobindo joined the extremist groups within the Congress. He actively participated in the national movement of India for around 5 years, and in combination with Chandra Pal and Bal Gangadhar Tilak, he vehemently protested against the partition of Bengal and also criticized the moderates and their methods within the Congress. So, his immediate involvement was during the Swadeshi movement and as a response to the partition of Bengal by the British rule, and he saw the nation as a mother, and therefore his engagement with the struggle for freedom, political freedom of the motherland is a more kind of religious duty, and therefore he conceptualized individual sacrifice for the creation or for the attainment of freedom for the motherland, and therefore he also was very critical of the methods that was being applied by the moderates, and he also gradually realized the servile or dishonesty on the parts of the British rule, and he realized that it cannot be trusted to allow the Indians to acquire the capability to represent themselves. In other words, he seriously doubted not just the methods of the moderates, but also the intention of the Britishers, and therefore became an enemy or the greatest enemy for the British. And many certainly one viceroy recommended that Aurobindo Ghosh is the force to reckon with for the British Empire in India, and he acquires immediately the position of prominent that is reflected in 1907 when Congress was there was a clear divide between extremists and the moderates, and for the next 10 years such divide was there. So, Aurobindo Ghosh was the chairman of the informal meeting of the extremist groups in the 1907 Surat Congress. So, that's his deep engagement or involvement with the national politics. At this point, it is also perhaps appropriate to understand the method he was contemplating for the political movement in India. So, like Gandhi, he was talking about the passive resistance as the method for political reforms or political movements in India. But what should be the method of such passive resistance? Should it be always unconditionally non-violent, as Gandhi was arguing, or there should be a scope of violence? Aurobindo Ghosh has a very innovative or unique response to such question, where he believes that the nature of response will depend on the nature of repression from the oppressors. So, if there is a time for arguing, articulating, mobilizing peacefully within the limits of the law or constitution, then one should have non-violent passive resistance. But if oppressor is too brute, then the violence or use of violence on the part of a resistor cannot be completely ignored or should not be criticized. So, the nature of response or the use of violence or non-violence depend on the condition, and Aurobindo Ghosh was very unique and different from Gandhian position on the passive resistance. So, in this period what we also find is he continuously wrote in Bande Mataram, a journal which was edited by Bipin Chandra Pal, and he himself started another journal called Karmayogin, which remained a powerful political commentary of that time. So, many leaders, certainly like Jawaharlal Nehru, who writes in the foreword to Karan Singh book on Aurobindo Ghosh and his thought, that he himself was when he was in England during that time, he used to read the commentaries or essay written by Aurobindo Ghosh in Bande Mataram to understand many of the political situation in India. as I was saying that in Aurobindo Ghosh, his treatment of native land or country as motherland, nation as mother, and believing and worshipping it as divine remains central to his political philosophy. For him, the struggle for nation and nationhood is not just kind of objective, instrumental approach to attain freedom, but for him it's a more kind of religious, spiritual activity to connect or to understand or realize the nation as a mother, and through that the attainment of a spiritual a spiritual life or a spiritual meaning of self and the other. So his engagement with Swadeshi or the political activities of that time was guided by this philosophy of understanding nation as a mother and believing and worshipping it as a divine. So he has a very religious or a spiritual understanding of nation or national freedom. When he was convicted of the Alipur bomb case, he was jailed for 1 year, after which he put an end to his political career, and through the later part of his life limited his activities to a spiritual domain. Perhaps this was also the time, in the words of Aurobindo, he realized his objective or the goal of life, that is in a spiritual domain, and he retired from the active politics after that incarnation, and went to French occupied Pondicherry, at that time called Chandranagar, close to Madras, and from then on, from 1910 to 1950s, involved himself in the spiritual activity. After this retirement, he founded one ashram in Pondicherry, which formally came into being in 1926, where he continued to stay till the end of his life in 1950s, and mainly he was engaged in writing and meditation. He considers the mystic experience of those days in Alipur jail as the factor leading to this transformation in his political spiritual life. And this was a transition from the nationalist, anti-colonial, revolutionary Aurobindo Ghosh to the international and cosmopolitan Sri Aurobindo. That's the kind of evolutionary understanding of self and the other or society that was there in Aurobindo's thought, deeply embedded in his political philosophy, is also exemplified in his own personal life, where he began as someone completely aloof from the Indian happenings, who deeply engaged with the activities in the political arena, was familiar with the radical or the revolutionary groups in Bengal, and then gradually transformed himself as a complete spiritual person. And this transformation of Aurobindo Ghosh to Sri Aurobindo also establishes focus on the international and the cosmopolitan ideals, all these things. So what we find in Aurobindo Ghosh and his major idea is the synthesis of Eastern and Western values. While taking the Western from in philosophy, he kept Indian its substance. So he was someone accommodative of different cultures, different intellectual tradition, and bringing them together, combining them together to give his own unique synthetic kind of philosophy and ideas. And he believed in the objectification of his spirit, that is the expression of the universal in the individual life. And this relationship between individual or the social or the universal is something which is deeply embedded or forms the basis of Aurobindo's political and spiritual ideas. In his opinion, it is the spirit alone that saves, and only by becoming great and free in heart can we become politically great and free. So for him, the political freedom or Swaraj is not just to achieve political independence merely, but until and unless we also realize or internalize this freedom or greatness in heart, in the spirit, that we are part of the whole, we are part of the universal, we are part of the social. We cannot be politically free or great. So for him, political freedom is something which enables the individual to realize this freedom and greatness in his or her heart, and only then a nation can become politically great and free. And in his thought, he was deeply influenced by European thinkers like Karl Lamprecht and Auguste Comte, and he borrowed the idea of distinct psychological stages that society passes through from Lamprecht, which is symbolic, conventional, individualistic and subjective. We will come to this when we will discuss his views on self. As I have discussed, that he regarded the path of passive resistance as appropriate in India's struggle for independence, but what should be the method of such passive resistance depend on the oppressors, the method that oppressors applies to tackle that resistance. And he was a passionate, more emotional, psychological supporter of Indian nationalism, and therefore Karan Singh rightly pointed out, and many others, including, as we have seen, this Bandhu Chittaranjan Das, prophet of Indian nationalism. And for him, nationalism was not merely a political program. Unlike many others, many of his contemporaries, the nation or nationalism for him was not merely a political program, but resembled a religion which is gifted by God, and all Indians should sacrifice for the attainment of such a spiritual or religious idea of nation as motherhood, the way he defined it. And there he differs a lot from many pragmatic thinkers of his time. And he also had a decolonized vision of international relation, and many argue, like Sartre and many others, the significance of Aurobindo to understand the global cooperation, global relationship between and among the nation states also. And this decolonized vision of international relation is inclusive of the other and recognize the possibility of alternative visions of a world state, and that is something which remains underexplored in Aurobindo Ghosh and his political thought, as I was saying in the beginning, because there is a serious reservation on the part of secularists to reduce him merely as a religious or a spiritual thinker, and on the part of right wingers to selectively appropriate him and understand him merely as a prophet of nationalism. But in Aurobindo's thought, there is the possibility of understanding or decolonizing the vision of international relation, as well as many thinkers have argued. So what we also find is that he was critical of democracy in both its bourgeoisie and socialist form. So there was the growing assertion of bourgeoisie form of liberal democracy on the other hand, or socialist form of democracy on the other hand. And Aurobindo was critical of both these forms, and what he proposed was a huge confederation of the people. He believed in this idea of confederation rather than a kind of organized instrumental of a system of governance. So he considered a spiritual religion of humanity as the hope of the future. He thought that the spiritual unity will lead to psychological unity, and his primary concern was the spiritual transformation of the people rather than material, political or economic transformation merely. And to attain that spiritual unity, he was arguing for a loose confederation of people rather than a well organized form of governance, be it liberal or socialist form of democracy. His canvas was too broad to reduce it merely as a religious or a spiritual thinker. So apart from being a radical activist in his early life and a spiritual in the rest of it, Aurobindo was a prolific writer, and some of his remarkable works are The Ideal of Human Unity, which remains his lifelong ideals, and he continued to practice such ideals in his ashram in Pondicherry, and that ashram in Auroville he continued to practice most of such ideals. So his focus was on the ideal of humanity, the life divine, Savitri, the synthesis of yoga, essays on the Gita, the integral yoga, the mind of light. So Aurobindo remained deeply engaged intellectually with many issues through his writings, besides his spiritual urge or spiritual practice or discipline in the most part of his life, but also as a revolutionary radical activist in early life. And he also published a journal which he titles Arya from 1914 to 1921. Now, to discuss his ideas on self, it is perhaps appropriate to begin with his understanding of human being or his or her ego, and what is the role of such ego and how one can transcend such ego, from this quotation which he wrote in True and False Subjectivism from the Human Cycle. For Aurobindo, the ego is not the self. There is one self of all, and the soul is a portion of that universal divinity. The fulfillment of the individual is not the utmost development of his egoistic intellect, vital force, physical well-being, and the utmost satisfaction of his mental, emotional, physical cravings, but the flowering of the divine in him to its utmost capacity of wisdom, power, love, and universality, and through this flowering, his utmost realization of all the possible beauty and delight of existence. So, for Aurobindo Ghosh, most certainly, and we will see how he differs from liberal and the utilitarian conception of self and the purpose in life, the ego that is there in this all being is not the self. For him, there is only one self which is there in all, and the soul in the self is the portion of that universal divinity which he also called Virat Purusha or supreme being. Now, the fulfillment of the individual life is not the utmost development of his egoistic intellect then, or vital force, or physical well-being, or the utmost satisfaction of his mental, emotional, physical cravings, but the flowering of divine in him, this realization that his is part of something bigger, which is in all self. That realization leads to utmost wisdom, power, love, and universality, and through this flowering one realizes all that possible beauty and delight of existence. So, this understanding in Aurobindo Ghosh is more evolutionary rather than static, rather than rigid or given. So, individual as his or her life unfolds, one realizes this purpose of life, which is not about fulfillment of the individual or his egoistic intellect or his personal individual biological needs, but the realization of this divine in him, and through that then one realizes the possible beauty and delight of human existence, and that is how he defines the individual and his self. So, this is then comes the connection between individual and the eternal self. Eternal self is something which is bigger, which is always there, which is omnipresent in everyone. So, unlike Christian theology, duality, natural and the supernatural, is not perceived in Indian philosophy, which is one way of differentiating between Indian philosophy or Indian philosophy of nature or self on the one hand, and the Christian or Western philosophy on the other. So, this duality of natural or supernatural is not perceived in Indian philosophy, and it views the natural and supernatural as the manifestation of the same energy. So, there is no kind of duality between nature or the supernatural. So, Aurobindo too, making the connection between the individual and the universal, argues that the eternal is the self of all other selves. So, what is eternal, what is universal is something which is there in everyone, in all selves, and it is the origin of all energy and support in nature. So, that is the vital force. This eternal self is always there, and it is manifested in individual self, and this manifestation is not just in one self or a group of self, but in all self, in all human being. And the task then for the human being is to realize that existence of divine in him, and that is something connected with the Tagore ideals of self, as we have discussed in previous lectures. So, for him the eternal or the supreme self is the supreme purusha or the Virat Purusha, and individual selves are the manifestation of that Virat Purusha or the supreme self. Now, what is true self then? In the individual, Aurobindo talks about true individual self and dipty selves. These dipty selves are the physical self, the vital self, the mental self, the supramental self and the blissful selves. So these are the different layers or different aspects of individual self, like physical, vital, mental, or supramental, and the finally is the blissful self. For him, the true self is not the body, the vital ego, or the rational mind. The spiritual individual resembles the true self. So for him, the true self is not the ego of the individual or his vital ego or rational mind, but the spiritual individual. Who is the spiritual individual? One who realizes the existence of divine in him, or existence of Virat purusha or supreme being in him, resembles the true self. To understand this, we can think about his evolutionary understanding of human collective self, from symbolic to conventional to individualist, and then finally subjective. So these are different stages of realization of collective human self. So first stage he calls symbolic stage, is the one in which all the institutions and things become for man a symbolic expression of the divine. That's the very primitive beginning of understanding the divine, which is more in terms of attributing some faculty to some institution, some form, and using it as a symbolic expression of the divine. So that's the symbolic stage of collective self. That is followed by the conventional stage, which is more rigid and formalized. So in all religion, or especially organized religion, this stage is more towards fixing the meaning, fixing or finality defines the conventional stage, which is that every religion in its fundamentalist kind of interpretation claims monopoly over absolute truth, and what it claims is considered as final. So that's the conventional stage of collective self, when there is a kind of rigid and formalized structure of divine self or divine understanding. Now this kind of understanding is followed by the resistance of reason and individual freedom, which he calls the individualist age. So the resistance to this fixed, rigid, formalized religion through reason or individual freedom, that's the beginning of enlightenment or modern liberal understanding of self or the individual, is that the reason and the individual is the true guide to understand the self and the other, and that is the hallmark of individualist stage. Now Aurobindo Ghosh is arguing for realization of the subjective age, and this subjective age is characterized by the emphasis on the spiritual freedom of individual, not merely the use of reasonal, rational faculty or the autonomy of the individual, but understanding the spiritual freedom. And this spiritual freedom again is the unity of self with the other, one human being with the rest of the human beings, and understanding that in all human beings there is the manifestation of same divine, same supreme being, which he also called Virat Purusha, and that is how he wanted to organize a confederacy of people and not really a kind of organized instrumental relations in or among the nation states. So for him, this subjective age or this spiritual freedom of individuals can be attained once individual internalize this belief, and this belief is about the existence of same force of divine or the Virat Purusha in him. And then when that individual, after internalizing that belief, also believe that the supreme being is one and all, expressed in the individual and in the collectivity, and only by admitting and realizing our unity with others can we fulfill our true self being. So for him, the realization of true self being requires or prerequisites this belief in the existence of supreme being, which is one and all, and expressed in the individual and in the collectivity, and only by admitting and realizing our unity with others. So the existence of individual human being is not in isolation, not an autonomous self-defining kind of subject, but in realizing this relationship or the intimate relationship with the others, because of this similar manifestation of divine in others also. only then he believes we can fulfill our true self being or realize our true self being. So, what we find in Aurobindo and his ideas on self, that he is very critical of Western liberal conception of man as a rational and autonomous being, or merely as a rational and autonomous being or self-defining subject. He was also critical of utilitarian view of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. That kind of utilitarian understanding of human being or human life was deeply problematic for Aurobindo, because in his views, such approach not only limits the rationalism, the meaning of rationality or rationalism for the individual, but also obstruct the spiritual and the political evolution of individual. That is something, is the constant evolutionary stages in human or collective social life that Aurobindo focuses. So, this understanding of individual or man as merely as a rational and autonomous being, or also the philosophy of greatest good of the greatest number, for Aurobindo actually obstruct this realization of a spiritual and political evolution in man. So, for him, man is not just a material or expression of material or a soul, but an spiritual evolutionary being, and this man is also a necessary force of a spirit for its evolutionary manifestation or progressive manifestation in the physical world. The point he is trying to make here is that the man or individual, and as we have discussed with in Tagore, the transcendence, immanent and the transcendence, something similar is here, and it is perhaps more clear. That is, that understanding of man is not merely as a manifestation of matter or a soul, but a spiritual evolutionary being, and this individual as a spiritual being is a necessary force of a spirit, and this spirit is something which is universal, something which is universal, something which is omnipresent, and something which is in all of us. Now, this spirit, this universal spirit or universal being manifest itself or manifest its progressive and evolutionary stages in the physical world, in our material world, through this man, which is a spiritual human being. So, there is a kind of complementarity between the universal spirit on the one hand and man on the other hand. So, man in a way, individual in a way, represent the universal spirit through his or her life, and through his activities and his life, his purpose is to expand such a realization and construct a relationship which is more based on love, harmony, cooperation, and transcending all kind of limitations and narrowness. So, what we also find, he interrelates the individual with the collective self or the society. Now, how he interrelates the individual with the other, as I was saying, that in connection with the others, in realization with others, the existence of divine, the human being realizes the true meaning of his self, and in a way represent the universal spirit in the physical world. So, through man, universal spirit manifests itself in the physical world. Now, this relationship between individual and the other or society is best summarized by Ghosh when he writes that a spiritual and political liberation is to be found in a very specific kind of relationship between the individual and society. It is Aurobindo's insightful discussion on this relationship that makes his great contribution to the world political thought and becomes the basis for his solution to the perennial question of how political freedom can be realized within the context of a spiritual perfection. So, for him, political freedom cannot be realized unless there is also a spiritual perfection, a spiritual realization. So, in this relationship between man and society, what we find in Aurobindo is this recognition that how political freedom or the condition which enables the individual realize his spiritual nature or a spiritual existence is something which can be attained collectively in a society, and therefore political freedom is necessary. But political freedom is incomplete or inadequate without the spiritual perfection, and that is the basis for his idea of nation, nationalism, or even the world relationship or the confederacy of people that he was arguing about. So, that is what is there in Aurobindo's political thought and his ideas on man, his personal engagement with the politics or the spiritual search in the manhunt. So, whatever we have discussed today, you can look at some of these texts, The Foundation of Indian Political Thought by V.R. Mehta, and also Sri Aurobindo and the Search of Political and Spiritual Perfection by Kenneth Deutsch and Pantham from their book on political thought in modern India. These texts remain the key text for our course. So, from this text there is one chapter by Kenneth Deutsch on Sri Aurobindo which you can look at. Also from Peter His edited Situating Sri Aurobindo, and then from Aurobindo himself you can find his essays on the human cycle, the ideal of human unity, war and self-determination, and certainly Karan Singh, especially his essay on Aurobindo the revolutionary and also prophet of Indian nationalism you can look at. So, please go through the readings, watch the lectures and let us know what you think about the lecture and about your queries and comments. Thank you.